Good morning. My name is Gillian Balaban and I am Standard Assistant at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on 26 March 2019. This in-person meeting is being hosted from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB webpage along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buck, Chief of Standards, Laura Espina, Senior Manager Standards, Pamela Carpio, Senior Coordinator Governance Relations, and Sarah Jane Dominic, Senior Manager Standards. We will now do a roll call. Corley Daru.
Good morning.
Thank you. Evan Harvey.
Good morning.
Thank you. Gustavo Sinner.
Hello.
Good morning. Jennifer Prinsing.
Present.
Thank you. Kent Swift.
Good morning.
Kirsten Margriet Hovey.
Present.
Thank you. Laura Dana Carter.
Good morning.
Thank you. Michelle Vasher.
Good morning.
Peter Colley.
Good morning.
Robin Leeson. Good morning. Thank you. Tung Lee Mo.
Present.
Thank you. And Vincent Kong.
Present.
And GSSB Chair, Judy Kuczewski.
Good morning.
Thank you, everyone. GSSB members Julia Wilson and Ramakrishnan sent their apologies. I will now hand to the Chair, Judy Kuczewski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Jill. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for coming today. We're very pleased to have Vincent Kong joining us today. I don't believe we are expecting anyone to leave early, is that correct? So we expect that our members will be able to stay for the duration of the meeting today. What we have to do this morning is, first of all, just look at our agenda. As you know, as you recall, from yesterday, we deferred the discussion of the Universal Standards Project proposal to this morning in order to give it the full attention of the GSSB. So we will open this morning with a long session dedicated to that topic. After the break, and before lunch, we will break the public meeting at that point and have an executive session, including some GSSB administrative matters. As you all know, all of our official decision-making is taken in the public domain, and therefore the executive session discussions are for information only. After lunch, we will reconvene the public meeting to discuss the GSSB work program, and then we expect to close at around 3:30 Amsterdam time. Are there any questions or clarifications about the agenda today? I'm not aware that anyone has raised any AOB points, any other business. Is that still the case? Obviously, we'll have an opportunity to discuss anything that might come up during the course of today, but if there's anything that you'd like to add formally to the agenda, if you could let me know, that would be great. And otherwise, I think I will hand it over to Sarah Jane to help us get a grip of the Universal Standards Project, please.
Thank you very much, Judy. I think in light of yesterday's discussions, comments, queries, we have revised the structure of our session slightly. We were intending yesterday to run through the proposal and get approval for that, and then have a more detailed discussion on the various aspects of the project. I think we flip it on its head and we do a more detailed discussion and see where that leaves us in terms of the scope and the project proposal. So one of the things, and I'm going to invite Bastian to do an introduction, is taking some time so that we are all of the same understanding when it comes to the purpose and intent of our framework and how we achieve that through the universal standards.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah Jane. And this is Well, on the one hand, a discussion that we probably need to have every now and then, just to reconfirm our joint understanding of what we're trying to address, in particular through GRI 101, what we're setting out in terms of the principles, but also the intent and purpose of the overall set of GRI standards. On the other hand, I think it is today an input to the discussion of around the comfort level of the GSSB, to what extent we should be opening up the core documents of our framework. And in context of the discussions that we had yesterday, looking at the recommendations of the Human Rights Technical Committee, once you start to open GRI 101 and GRI 102, as well as GRI 103, that seems to be in order, given the recommendations, to look at how we can reflect on the guiding principles, but also the OECD due diligence work adequately in the standards. There is an opportunity to extend the scope and look at fixing other things that we have noted, or at least explore which additional items we can take on. But let us start just with the very basic premise on which the standards are built, and that is a very singular focus on the contribution to sustainable development and, importantly, the impacts. Everything that is written up right now, at least in intent, and then we can discuss how much we actually realize that in the actual write-up, is driving reporting inside out, the impacts on others, the impacts on society, the economic, environmental, and social impacts. That is the focus of the framework as it has been set out. I think this dates back really to the early days, but certainly in the combination of the principles that you see here: stakeholder inclusiveness, sustainability, context, materiality, and completeness for report content. That dates back to 2006 and the G3 guidelines. We have, over time, refined some of the contents of these principles, but in actual fact, most of this content is untouched since the process that was run between 2004 and 2006. From a standards division perspective, there is actually no reason to change the intent of the framework, certainly also in light of this being pretty much the only global effort to focus on impacts on others as opposed to the impacts on the business. But there is the question that was raised by the Technical Committee for Human Rights, as well as feedback that we're receiving on the implementation of the standards, whether we actually give the right level of guidance for those that want to apply the standards, to do that with the right outcome. Reports that actually are true reflection of the contribution to sustainable development and the impacts of the company. Yesterday we touched upon, in particular, the element of materiality, of course, in light of the recommendations of the Human Rights Technical Committee. And there is also a component of that affects directly the stakeholder inclusiveness principle. When you look at the role of stakeholders and the explanations that Laura and Dwight provided yesterday on the recommendations, there is also more work needed there to clarify the role and the relation with stakeholders. Where we are here now is that we have an opportunity to discuss the scope today of the review of GI 101, the principles, and the basic premise here is do we want to go beyond reflecting on different scenarios on how we can build on the recommendations of the Human Rights Technical Committee? And are we in a position right now to say that we want to explore whether other principles need to be reviewed as well, and guidance that we're providing. I think there are two levels to this discussion. On the principle level, one is changes to the actual principles or changes to the guidance, and these are probably different things in terms of scope. But then also importantly, what happens with GRI 102 and 103, because there are direct implications. In particular, in GRI 102, you have quite a range of disclosures regarding the reporting process and also the stakeholder engagement. And they would be directly affected if we start to look at changing guidance to the principles. That's definitely a given. There is at this point no ambition from the standards division to extend this beyond to the topic-specific standards. There is a component of the human rights recommendations that, of course, deals with topic-specific standards. That is something we also need to provide as part of the larger project, the implications of how we deal with human rights-related topic standards going forward. But there are no other changes that we anticipate on that level. It is really focused on GRI 101, 102, and 103. Where we see the scope that we want to discuss today. Maybe for a start, the basic question here, is there anything that you've seen in terms of reporting practice, application of the GRI standards, where you would say that that would lead to work as part of the project, things that we should consider in terms of scope for a review of GRI 101, 102, and 103. And we will then, together with Sarah Jane and Laura in a moment, look at the work streams that we've outlined in the work program or the proposal for this project to decipher a bit what we see in reality in reporting practice and what we would like to address with you. But it's maybe good to just start with this very basic premise, whether there are things that you're observing in the market, in the application, that you would feel would fall under this project now.
Any observations about either the application of the existing standards or just generally sort of practices in sustainability reporting today that you think are relevant for this discussion? Evan.
Well, I'll just raise a point that I think that one of the strengths of the standards is the structure, and I think that it is a very understandable structure with the foundation and then the topic disclosures on top. So I would be reluctant to change that structure very much. I mean, I think that the way it's laid out is actually very logical, and most people get it right away when they look at the numbers and they look at how the disclosures are aligned. So I agree that there may be some topics like human rights that deserve a closer look at. Maybe that needs to be applied on a universal level, but I wouldn't want to do anything that fundamentally altered this structure, because I think it's one of the strengths of the framework.
Anyone else? Robin.
Yeah, it might be sort of going over some old ground. I think in terms of the correcting or having some more narrative around the materiality piece, because we're seeing, I think everyone knows that we're seeing some practices that aren't what the principle really intends, and also sustainability context, which I don't think anyone particularly does well in terms of the reports that we see out there. I think there's still a bunch of things in 102 which were crafted quite a while ago and well-intentioned, but a lot of reporters just sort of shrug their shoulders or look a bit perplexed or give sort of boilerplate responses to them because the intention perhaps has either shifted or was never quite clear in the first place. And then we also have the issue with the core versus comprehensive and GRI referenced, which I think needs we'll do a workout on that soon anyway in the discussion.
Anyone else? Yeah, I would personally agree with everything that Robin just said, and I happen to think that material. I mean, while the while the understanding of the principle of materiality, I think, is a lot better than it was 10 years ago, the practice seems rather perfunctory and kind of stuck. And I would see us do something to sort of move along the practical application of materiality. And I would say definitely that the levels of application and we don't call it that anymore, but you know what I mean, the framework for conformance with the standards needs a clear rethink, I would say. Okay, I think you could probably move on, Bastian or Sarah Jane?
Yeah, what I would suggest is then that we start to look into the work streams that we've outlined in the proposal, and only at the end see whether you can confirm the proposal as we've laid it out. And I think all the points that were mentioned now will actually form part of the discussions that we've outlined. It is, I think, important now. We will probably not be able to fix the exact scope of what we want to do, much in light of the discussion we had yesterday. Also, there are different ways of integrating contents from the Human Rights Technical Committee, but also we will probably find that some things are not really in reach, given capacity, but also the level of change you want to induce. But it would be good to bring everything to the table now, that the team can actually then create in the next weeks an overview of the changes that seem realistic, and then we refine the scope together with you based on a next discussion.
Okay, thank you, Bastian and Judy. So, just to reiterate, this was discussed back in February when we first tabled the draft proposal. But we've already touched upon one of the key drivers for this was the human rights recommendations and then the onward impact on the universal standards, which led us to consider what else could be in scope if we were opening up the universal standards. Clearly, there is this knock-on impact of changes in responsible business conduct beyond the field of human rights. And I think from our perspective, this commitment to regularly review our content and requirements to understand that it is driving quality reporting. And I think aligned with that as well, that we are encouraging new adopters of the standards, and they would be from a range of organizations. And we would seek to enable them to start reporting. So the two objectives we had was considering the incorporation of the recommendations from the human rights, but also making any other appropriate revisions whilst we were doing that to drive this consistent application. So if we then look at the individual work streams, we have the first work stream, and I think there probably isn't a great deal to add to the discussion from yesterday. So we talked about all the various scenarios, how we could incorporate those human rights disclosures, the knock-on impacts there may be on the management approach because of adopting this due diligence approach in line with the OECD and the guiding principles from the United Nations. And the question of whether you could apply this to other topics outside of human rights and whether that would make sense. So unless anyone else has anything to add to that discussion, I think I could probably move on to the next work stream. Okay. So in terms of the second work stream, so the main thing we probably discussed yesterday was materiality and aligned with that stakeholder inclusiveness because of this understanding of saliency, prioritization, etc. And I think some of the things that we have thought about investigating is the actual application of all four reporting principles that define report content. And we had also flagged here the use of the concept, it's not a principle, but the use of the concept topic boundary. And I don't know whether it's worthy. So we have been doing some background research by reviewing standards reports over the last couple of months. And there are certainly some challenges with the understanding of some of our concepts definitions. So just to give you some highlights, and these are not statistically significant, but they are merely an indication. So 8 out of 48 reports we looked at, and they were a mix of core and comprehensive. Only 8 of them clearly focused on outward impact only. Others maybe had a hybrid approach, or they were very clearly looking at business risk. So only 8, you could clearly understand that they were using impact in the way that we had intended it. Now, this is what they've reported. What they actually did when it came to the application to their material topics, we don't know. But there was that. And then in terms of topic boundary, 9 out of 48 reports didn't refer to topic boundary. So it was unclear as to whether it was their consolidated entities or, the entities they would annually report on. Others made reference to it, and they may have had one paragraph that talked about topic boundary for all topics, or they may have categorized it between, environmental, social, but there weren't many where it was a clear understanding per material topic about what the topic boundary was. So there's certainly, when it comes to the application, it isn't clear to us or apparent from the reporting that we get that there is a good understanding of impact and topic boundary. Couple of other instances, 5 reporters out of 48 didn't define the stakeholder component of materiality. So it was unclear who they were talking about, what was relevant to whom in their disclosures. And we would say only 11, so less than 25%, had a clear explanation of all aspects of the materiality principle, from identifying stakeholders to understanding what was relevant to them, and then linking it to their material topics. So some would have covered some aspects, but only 11 had a clear and extensive understanding of all aspects. So in terms of the application, that does leave us with a question of, is this something that we can improve by looking at the actual definitions, the guidance, or is it to be addressed in some other way? And I think I would encourage any discussion on, is this how we fix it? And it will improve it, or is it done in some other way?
Do we know enough to be able to answer that question or to discuss it intelligently?
If nobody has any comments, then...
Shall we see, does anyone have an opening gambit on that one? It would seem to me we'd probably need to kind of see some more material before we'd be able to really get stuck into that discussion. But are there any clarifying questions or anything that anyone wants to put on the table now? Doesn't look like it. I think we'll just move on, huh? Yeah.
Okay, no problem. So the third element of this project, the work stream that we had defined, was truly understanding the in accordance criteria and considering whether we wanted to make any changes to this. So it's apparent that not many reporters choose to go the comprehensive route. So I think when I did a quick cursory understanding of the verified reports we've registered, I think it was 16-17% had chosen the comprehensive or made a claim in accordance with the comprehensive option. The remainder were core, but what we understand as well, and this is, more anecdotal, is they go beyond core. So they sit somewhere in the middle because there might be areas that they, want to do all of the disclosures for a material topic, and others where they only want to choose to disclose one indicator. So you wouldn't say that they are strictly core. They're probably sitting somewhere in the middle, but for whatever reasons, they've chosen not to address all indicators for all material topics or disclosures. And I think for me as well, there is some potential improvement for transparency for a report user to understand how they have complied, a reporter, whether it be the core or the comprehensive, and is it apparent to a user how they have addressed that. So I think there is one element there that if we choose to continue with the core and comprehensive, how can we make it easier for users of the reports to understand how they addressed all the relevant requirements? Aligned with this as well is the reasons for omission. And we've done some understanding that they are widely used, the reasons for omission, but sometimes they are using not one of the ones that we, encourage. There's some generic statement about why they couldn't disclose, but it doesn't really clearly fall into one of the categories that we have about confidentiality, etc. So it definitely is used, and I think, again, from a user's perspective of the report, it's not always clear which bits they opted out of and why, and that might be useful context to understand. And I'm not suggesting that the reasons for omission aren't valid, but it's not always transparent. And then the wording of the claim is something that we could choose to look at. But I think in this, there is a big question mark over, do we continue with the core and comprehensive, or do we move to not a simpler reporting model, but one reporting model so that you say you're in accordance or not?
And maybe just to add to that, so during the transition to standards, we basically parked this issue. At the time, it was still, the change of G3.1 to G4 was still reasonably close. The introduction and refinement of that whole approach was basically just settling in with reporters. And back then, the GSB said, well, we have to wait until the standards are applied for a couple of years, and then we look at this again, whether we want to induce more change around this. And the basic premise at the heart of it is, do we actually have to have a staged system with core comprehensive, or is it actually about you either apply the standards or you don't, and there's transparency to what extent you apply the standards. In a voluntary setting, the idea has always been that core and comprehensive somehow you would actually enable organizations to progress towards more full reporting. That's one. But also you would acknowledge that some will never have the ambition to be very comprehensive in their application. But what we left it with at the time was then the question, is actually the complexity that is induced by such a system counterintuitive and actually not helpful, because it is difficult for report users, the readers of the reports, to understand to what extent the standards have been applied. And wouldn't it be simply a question which disclosures have been applied, and if they have not been applied and the organization claims to be in accordance with the standards or applying the standards to a rigorous level, an explanation needs to be provided, and stakeholders can form an opinion whether that's an adequate explanation of why certain information is not provided. So that's an underlying, and it is a fairly structural component, and would be a very significant change. On the other hand, what we see a lot is feedback. And in conversations with regulators and others, they say, surely if you have now an established set of standards, you either apply them or you don't. But you seem to muddy the waters by saying, well, you can apply them half. You can actually bail out for some of the things, and it is not quite clear on what grounds you do that, right? In the background, there's also the struggle that came up in the last day already, to be responsive to the needs of smaller and medium-sized enterprises, those that are less resourceful. But also there, when you look at the extent of disclosure that is actually prescribed on the core level, then it begs the question whether that is actually responsive to their needs, or whether a more open system where they can opt in for those things that they want to be transparent around, as opposed to a prescribed list that never quite matches the realities of specific institutions. That's maybe more of the background, and I think for us at the Standards Division, it would now be very helpful to collect opinions about whether you feel that this is something we should explore more, and develop more research, and also questions that you would like to see answered in light of Judy's point that we need more information to directionally take decisions here. What would it be that you would like to see that can inform your decision making going forward?
Okay, Evan and then Kirsten.
Well, part of the information that I'd like to see is we know the percentages on core versus comprehensive reporting, and maybe the percentages are a little exaggerated. Maybe they're not applying the principles properly. But what is the value add? What do you hear from companies? What's the value add of reporters in going to that comprehensive level? What are they telling you about why they go there and what value they derive or benefits they derive by doing so? I think that would be an important piece of information, because for creating a standard that essentially is aspirational and has no real merit for companies or has no real advantage for companies, then maybe we should rethink the two-tier system.
Also anecdotal, but based on my experience, the few companies I know about or have any direct contact with that have chosen the comprehensive reporting, that's more based on the top management decisions than on recommendations from the reporting experts. Also, it's not my impression, still, anecdotal, that a comprehensive report should be better than a core report. Of course, there are lots of very weak core reports that hardly fulfill the core requirement. But not least, there are lots of comprehensive reports that hardly fulfill the comprehensive requirements. In my opinion, this should be about, is this a report in accordance with the GRI standards, or is it not? Either you are following IFRS or you are not. You're not following it to a certain degree, or you are following it fully. You are in compliance.
Michel.
I can give an element of answer for us. We're core because there are some elements of disclosures that we don't have available and we don't know when we will have them. And so if there is even one indicator missing in a disclosure where you have 6 or 7 indicators, well, we can't be comprehensive. It's as simple as that.
Gustavo.
Hi, thanks. As Sebastian says, it's a way to push the company to a progressive reporting cycle. But in that case, we found that the core and comprehensive standards sometimes is like a confusion situation to some readers or some people from compliance. We agree about the 2 accordance criteria because some companies are like afraid to start reporting. So the core accordance is like the first and easy step. I agree that some companies are very comfortable in the core criteria, so they don't have the ambition to go to the other level. But if we have the exhaustive, comprehensive, yeah, sorry, I have it in Spanish. The comprehensive, if we go to a comprehensive criteria, we have the omission part to say that I cannot complete that disclosure. So in somehow it's going to be, it's like the different ways to have a comprehensive report with different steps. I really don't have in my mind which is better, to leave the criteria or not, but what we seen from companies that we understand that the financial reports, you have the standards that you have to complete to accomplish the financial is 0 or 1 is only one option, but the people who made the financial reports have to study, have to prepare very time to do it. So these kind of reports, there is no such of preparation. So it's like a self-implementation. So in somehow, in the first points that you talk about, is interesting that to have some guidelines or steps to move forward and to self-learn how to do it. I think in G4 it was some steps about that now, but I think that we have to move in that direction to the people can self-implement these reports, because they not had study to do it, so it's like a big effort, big issue to start reporting in this.
Jennifer.
I think it would be useful for the project to certainly collect information about the perspective of the readers and users of the report on the two levels. From my experience as a reporter, many of the assessments and ratings that we subject ourselves to will ask and will score, do we have a sustainability report to the GRI? Never ask to what level, right? So I don't think that necessarily is viewed or valued in that particular context. I know I think, like to say that we report comprehensive as an indicator of our leadership in our reporting, more from a talking about it standpoint than in an actual valued concretely in any of those ratings or assessments. But my opinion, I don't know if that's common. So gathering that data would be good.
Yeah, I think you know, as Bastian sort of told the story about how we discussed this and parked it, because we knew that this was a discussion that needed a proper process behind it, and the fundamental project of the transition to standards was not to introduce something substantially new in that, but to just carry over what we had from G4 into the format of standards. So we knew we had to come back to this at some point. But I think my sense has been that the core and comprehensive, and the way that Kirsten sort of described it as well, I think in practice what has been borne out is that core has kind of by default become the binary. You're implementing GRI or you're not implementing GRI, and comprehensive is sort of something beyond that. And in a way, what was attempted all those years ago with core and comprehensive was to sort of cover both the accountability of reporters, to apply the standards properly, and also to provide some kind of encouragement to reporters to do it as well as they can and to carry on their reporting journey as far as they can. I'm not entirely sure that it does either of those really well. It does something, but we're not sure what it does. So, and in a way, I think we have to kind of get some decent evidence together to decide if we want to do both of those things, if we want to accomplish both of those things, can we do it with the same in accordance framework, or do we need to kind of think about two different things here? We also have, I'll just put it out there that it's a sort of obvious point, I suppose, but one of the differences with other standards, if you look at standards as opposed to just sort of voluntary initiatives, which GRI has kind of also resembled over the years. But the comparison with standards is that for most of the others, it's not a question of self-certifying. It tends to be something that involves some kind of a third-party assessment. Depends on where who's promulgating it and where these standards actually appear. But I don't think we have any particular plan to change that at the moment. But I would say that probably does have a significant impact on what this actually looks like in practice for GRI reporters. I'm seeing Michelle and Kirsten's things up. Would you like to speak, Kirsten? Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
I had forgotten to take it down, but realized that I wanted to speak anyway. I think it's a good point you raised there, Judy, by standards are usually being certified by somebody else. And there, of course, we do have the possibility of having two levels. The one is the self-declared GRI, following the GRI standards, and the second is the externally verified, that we are following the GRI standards.
Peter.
I still come to this with a fairly open mind, given this is my first GSSB meeting. One of the aspects I don't think we've canvassed so far is the core and comprehensive was part of, or you said encouraging people to be GRI reporters. Michelle said companies can often choose to be a core reporter because they simply are not at a point yet where they can gather the information for other topics. And that raises the point that companies, when they're doing a GRI report, they do want to look good, they don't want to look bad. And if you've got to say that we can't gather the information on various indicators, it doesn't make you look very good. But then that then goes to the issue about are people doing GRI reports now because they're keen, socially responsible organisations, or because they need to do some kind of sustainability report. And I suppose that's what we've got to look at. If they need to do a sustainability report, then there is less of a requirement to gently encourage people in terms of having two levels of compliance. You can just do what Kirsten suggested. You either comply or you don't comply. But the GRI reports do allow you to say why you aren't doing a topic, but you do have to explain why you're not doing it. That's my understanding. And that will make life a bit more difficult for reporters, but we do have to think, is that the way we should be going in terms of getting a higher level, better quality reports?
Maybe just one addition from me in terms of the day-to-day experience with the in accordance criteria. We receive lots of technical inquiries. And I think it's safe to say that a change between G4 and the standards is that we have fewer overall on in accordance. And that has maybe to do with the effort to explain the in accordance and the core and comprehensive in a more straightforward way in the standards. But overall, in relation to other inquiries that we see, it's still the most prominent area. There's a lot of confusion around this. People that come to it fresh, they don't necessarily understand the intent. Then when it comes to the reasons for omissions, that's also what we anecdotally see and some of the research. It is not quite clear how this can be applied. It sometimes seems to fuel a bit of the reaction, well, unless we can fully demonstrate application, we're not moving towards comprehensive, we stick to core, and that's probably where we will stay forever, which is, in terms of the transparency ambition that we have, probably not pointing in the right direction. And I think, picking up also on the point that Kirsten was making around, there are maybe other parties that need to come to conclusions on whether or not the standards are applied in full. What's important is that the standards drive mechanisms that enable reporters to be transparent about to what extent they have applied them, and then it's very clear how to do that. And that's probably where the responsibility of a standard setter of the GSSB ends. And then we can take part in other discussions, education, third-party type of verification, and how you relate opinions as to whether the standards have been applied. But that's almost outside of what you can write up in the standard itself. Right now, we have this duality where we're still trying to do the educational piece, moving people from core to comprehensive, providing different entry points. But we're also not quite clear then on the transparency aspects, and this raises a lot of questions. I think that's fair to say.
Evan and Gustavo.
Just really quickly, to push back a little bit on what Peter said on a narrow piece of this, which is I don't really perceive a lot of reputational enhancement for companies moving or for reporters moving from core to comprehensive. It's like I think Kirsten, maybe Bastian said, the 0 or the 1 is, are you a GRI reporter? And that's where the credit seems to lie. Companies like Solvay or Dow that want to go to another level, they may have their own reasons for wanting to do so, but I don't think it's a marketplace valuation thing necessarily that's driving them there.
Yeah, aligned to that. At the end, I think it is important that the final users of the reports, they can tell us what is, if it's necessary, if they understand, if they see difference between a core and a comprehensive report. I think that could be a great input to understand in what direction we have to move. And about the complex of the core or comprehensive technical questions and that, I see that there are two parts of the two different impacts of these criteria, because in the governance disclosures there is a big difference. It's like if you are a public company that you are in the stock market, you can accomplish that kind of disclosure easily. But if you are a private company, and we have to think that there are countries that don't have a big stock market, there are a lot of private companies, and that kind of disclosure, the difference between one or another, are really sometimes impossible to accomplish, because about the remuneration of the director is something important. That's in that part of the difference of the criteria. But in the topic disclosure, then you have one or fulfill all of the topic. I think that could be easily pushed in just only one accordance criteria, because we've seen that, okay, I choose a core criteria, but in energy I fulfill the 5 disclosures without problem. So I think that would be, in that part, would be a not different and so important difference. But in the governance part, yes, it would be a very different impact. That's all.
Thank you. Anyone else? I mean, my own view, Sarah Jane, is that the discussion that we've just been having around the in accordance criteria, for all that we didn't really discuss very much the second question around these particular reporting principles and concepts and the sort of topic barrier and materiality and so forth. I actually think we could have replayed more or less the same conversation around those, because one of the sort of challenging ideas around the reporting principles and concepts is that there isn't a sort of easily understood binary. You know, you've either applied that or you haven't applied that. You know, and I think it's I think these questions are very interrelated, actually. So I'll leave it at that, but I think you know what I'm getting at. Peter, did you want to get in again?
It's more of a point of information or an example to give. It's on this issue of if companies or reporting organisations don't want to move along the path to comprehensive because it shows that they have gaps in their systems, and that's not good in terms of having a good-looking sustainability report. That is part of the education process that we have to go through with reporters about the merits and the uses of the sustainability report. And the analogy I want to draw is with modern slavery legislation in the UK, and it's coming in Australia, is that it is expected that companies in certain industries are almost inevitably going to find modern slavery somewhere in their supply chain. And that shouldn't be, and so in companies which are doing good reporting and are finding that are not being pilloried or attacked because they've discovered they do have modern slavery in their supply chain. Is actually the experts in the area say that lots of companies are going to find modern slavery in their supply chain if they're doing a good job on the reporting, and that gives them something to work with. It's not automatically their fault and they're bad if they've discovered due to good reporting that they have modern slavery in their supply chain. It's something to work on. So part of good sustainability reporting is about finding the shortcomings in your systems, and the preparers of sustainability reports and the companies that are doing them should be getting used to that idea a bit more, that they are going to show shortcomings in their systems, which they will then be working on in the future.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that and also leave that with the GSB for future discussions of the in accordance as part of the project. I think what we see overall is a change in terms of how people look at sustainability reporting. We're moving away, at least in some jurisdictions, and certainly also when you look at the methodologies of the research and ranking firms, we're moving away more and more from just this binary, okay, this is responded to, or they are GRI reporters, and there is more appreciation also for the complexity of some of the things that companies encounter, and that transparency is actually a first step to acknowledge that and then have a public process of dealing with it. When we read reports now, I would say that this is one of the most distinct changes that we've seen in the last 10 years. More and more companies have an approach where they start to talk about the issues that are really tricky for them to resolve on their own, or that they're not quite sure on how to solve them. They are actually becoming more public on these issues. I think the few leaders in the human rights field, definitely that's the case. But across the board, we're moving away from reporting only at the moment that you have a solution to the issue. And I think that's actually something we should think about to encourage also as part of the transparency exercise, because for very many of the issues that we're addressing, there are probably very few that can be comprehensively report on this from the get-go. And it is much more about this idea that over time you progress towards sufficient levels of transparency. But in actual fact, just acknowledging an issue and starting these to talk about what the plans are to address them is actually something that is fully in line with the standards and the intent of and purpose of the standards.
Jennifer.
I just wanted to mention, I think a real benefit and reason for a two-tiered accordance is for the new and/or smaller companies. I don't think that's been mentioned, but you know, the core requirements are a hurdle that new reporters can get over, whereas comprehensive, I think, it's a very high hurdle, and new reporters can at least get started and are still required to assess all of their material topics. So even at core level, a company, to be in accordance, will have to identify core topics, material topics, whether they're able to fully report on all of them. So I think there is really value in having some level where a new reporter can get in and get a report out there and have value without going all the way, at least initially.
Kirsten and then Evan.
I do understand what you are saying, Peter. At least I believe I do. Still, I think it's important to be reminded that the GRI standards, it's not something that is carved in stone. We see it when we revise single standards, that there is information that we find that, well, it wasn't that important anyway, or we haven't been able to get the information out of it that was probably originally intentioned when it came into the standard. And that is also what we as reporters are seeing, that certain reporting requirements doesn't really make sense to us. And if we're going to report on something that doesn't give any sense to us, the quality of reporting of that piece of information will not be a quality information. When we have, to make good reporting, we need that it's relevant to the reporting organization. And there is a need for different organizations to cover different needs through the reporting. And I don't think that by reporting everything that is required according to comprehensive, that would make good reporting for all organizations. On the opposite, we are at risk that because there's so much that must be reported, the quality of what is really important will decrease because we need to report on so many other things as well. Thank you.
Just to Bastian's point about, if the trend really is towards companies reporting on things where they have no performance, they have no record, or they're aware of the issues, if we do embed the due diligence approach into the universal standard, doesn't it sort of compel that kind of thought process in the reporting? So, that may be one way to solve that problem and future-proof the standards a little bit more.
Anyone else? What do you think, Sarah Jane? Would you like to respond at all, or do you want to carry on with?
There's one other aspect that becomes apparent to me is that if you're doing a core, you're required to disclose all the management approach disclosures within a topic-specific standard, and then one of the topic-specific disclosures, which are more the quantitative indicators. I think there's a question for me of, does that make sense? So if you have chosen greenhouse gas emissions, you look at the emissions topic-specific standard, there are 7 disclosures. You could select only one. That might be the easiest to measure, but is that really giving the user a true picture of what was really driving the materiality of that topic in the first place? So some of them, like the waste one that I'm very happy you approved yesterday, only has 1. But within that one quantitative metric, there's a lot of depth, right? So does this drive us into thinking about how we collate indicators together in a topic-specific standard that almost undoes that? So I think there's something about how we develop the standards going forward. The tax one is unusual in a certain respect, in that you would feel, and like the waste one, you'd want all of the disclosures really to get a full picture. So this picking and choosing, does it work, or is a better model to say, okay, what's your really material topic, if I can use that, wouldn't it be better to have a more holistic picture of that topic? And okay, there are some things you can't measure, but at least you are acknowledging you can't measure them and why, rather than picking the easy to measure, which I'm sure happens.
As someone who took part in that discussion in the G4 days, I can tell you there was a good deal of splitting the difference in how we kind of approached the creation of this. So yeah, it's not surprising that it manifests itself in a slightly odd and unsatisfactory way. I think it's fair to say. Michel and Kirsten and
Yes.
Gustavo.
Well, I just wanted to bounce back on that example. There isn't a standard for greenhouse gas emissions. There's a standard for emissions.
There is, but
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry.
Yes, but
5 of the 7 are greenhouse gas.
Yes, but it means that if you are not reporting hazardous air pollutants and persistent organic pollutants, you're not complying with the full standard. And reasons for omission are not, we're not going to do it. It's when are you going to do it? So you see, that's typically an example where we have to say, okay, we can't disclose it fully because we don't have it. And we don't know when we're going to have it.
But I would say, is that driving the right behavior then? Is that where we want to be, or, you know, what's the compromise?
What I mean is, especially for companies that are transforming, meaning they're buying and selling companies, there will always be part of the business that is unable to comply with some of the requirements. And that's the main difficulty we faced. If we start to, you acquire a company and you start to tell them, okay, from now on you have to report on all that, we have to start somewhere, and it takes between 5 and 10 years to have them comply fully. You buy a new group and you're still out of it. Or you start to have a different scope of reporting per indicator, which is a mess. That's what I mean. Being totally comprehensive, the only way we could do it is to start not to disclose on full standards. When we start to say, okay, we are missing 1 or 2 indicators, then we're going, and you can't say, I mean, we can't say in emissions that some of the indicators are not material and others are, or it becomes a mess in explaining why we don't disclose it. That's the difficulty we have as a reporter, is that sometimes there are just some disclosures where we say, no, we're not going to do that.
When we're talking about materiality of topics, I think that's maybe where some of the challenge is. We have chosen to go further and not evaluate only if a topic is material, but even if each single indicator below that topic is material. And if we find a topic to be material, it would never be acceptable for us to choose the easiest way out. But then we look at the indicators and say that, well, actually, that indicator is not material to us, but this one is. It's, unfortunately to us, it's the most difficult one to report on. But then we have to strive to be able to report on that, if not this year, so maybe in 3 years. And there, I believe that there is an improvement potential in the universal standards to look deeper into the materiality process. To avoid that example of, yeah, you find that this topic is material, and then you report on this single indicator that is very easy to report on, and it might even not be directly material to the organization to report on.
Gustavo.
Yeah, thanks. I continue with the example that you say about emissions. I found that the core option is sometimes it's like a short, because you have emissions like a material topic. It's because I have a great implemented system to measure emissions, so I can fulfill the company fulfill 2 or 3 indicators, because I have the direct emissions, the intensity, and of course the reduction activities. So the companies doesn't choose only one; they report the 3 of them. But in following, as she says, we see that it's good to push the companies to fulfill the other 3 disclosures between 2 years, 3 years, because it's like I think that the work of GRI is good to push the companies to have new measures, to have new indicators. In the way, as I said, it's like, okay, GRI is a reporting organization to report, but sometimes the companies use it as a management orientation. So some companies do to accomplish GRI reports. Sometimes they discover or create new indicators in their systems. So I think that in the topic part, the core option is like short. The companies always move some step forward. The comprehensive in the topic part is ambitious, but I think that is a good north to the companies.
Corley.
Thanks. I've been listening to a lot of the conversation, and many of the comments are from the perspective of the report preparers. There were some comments about the users of the report and, you know, the fact that they don't really distinguish whether a report is core or comprehensive. So I think, you know, in doing some research around this, it's important to understand firstly why the regime was introduced and what the value was intended to be. Was it to assist report preparers to kind of be on this journey towards better disclosure? But I also still get a sense that, you know, if an analyst looks at a sustainability report, they're going to be looking for the presence of certain pieces of information. They're not going to go, oh, this is a core report, so you can expect there to be certain things absent. They're just going to go, well, in my mind, this is a material issue. Why have you not reported on it? And they're not going to be happy with an answer that says, because our report is only core in accordance with the GRI standards. So often it's also a matter of semantics and how the concept is explained. So, you know, whether there is a kind of a spectrum of accordance or application of the criteria or not, I think it's important that whatever direction it takes moving forward, that there is the ability for companies to kind of explain that. And I'm by no means, you know, proposing a comply or explain kind of a regime, because that has, you know, connotations all of its own. But I do think that it's important to find a balance between what's useful for the report preparers, but also for the report users.
Oh, Robin. She's sitting right next to me.
Yeah, I'd just like to agree with Corley's comment that it might be worth opening up the archives to some extent to look at what the current regime of in accordance was designed to address regarding the previous one, where we had the bad old days of levels A, B and C, and how that was arguably used to sort of push the bell curve a little bit to get more disclosure, but then was misused in terms of being a proxy for quality, in terms of how organisations were sort of communicating the level that they got. But there's probably some record and living memory of those discussions and how that how it was perceived by report preparers and report users back then. Because I know I remember there was some disappointment from report preparers on the A, B and C sort of going, being jettisoned, possibly for some of the wrong reasons, but it might be worth opening up some of that history.
Sarah Jane.
Thanks, that's very useful. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is the development of the sector. standards and the level of authority applied to that, because how does that interplay with the core if you've said, you're in oil and gas and here's, your expected material topics, and then what do we expect to see ensuing in terms of disclosures arising from that? So that's something we're very mindful of, that, if we go ahead with this project, we are revising principles that, they're almost starting with what we have now, and we need to be speaking together to see, the direction we're developing in and how we interplay with each other.
I would say, just building on that, in addition to the sector disclosures evolving, I mean, a further sort of difference between GRI standards and a lot of other standards is that every single one of the universal and topic-specific standards is literally a standard. And yet we have a single kind of conformity approach for all of them, regardless of which ones or what combination or how many a reporter might be choosing to apply. And that could itself be creating some significant, well, just anomalies, I think, in the way that this plays out. Anyone else have any observations around this particular in accordance criteria discussion? Do you feel like you sort of have a decent landscape of content to be looking at? Do you have any, are there any further questions that you have for the GSSB about this one?
No, I think that's very useful, and we'll come on to a discussion later about the evidence gathering, as I call it, that we're going to do to inform us better of perspectives and, how people interpret the in accordance, be it a preparer or a user, and how that plays out in reality. So we'll definitely gather some additional data in this area.
Shall we go on to the fourth question here around the general disclosures?
Of course, yeah. So the general disclosures were potentially going to be impacted by how we would incorporate some of the human rights disclosures, because this is the area where we mandate specific disclosures for all organizations, depending on whether they are a core or comprehensive reporter. So the last discussion has a direct impact on the 102 disclosures. Everything is to a certain degree interlinked in this project, even though we have separated it into separate work streams. We have, as well as looking at some of the reporting principles application, looked into an understanding of how general disclosures are reported. We already have a good steer from the technical inquiries we get as to the challenging, troublesome ones. So it wasn't a surprise when we went to look at reports that they were the ones that were more challenging, because even though for some of our disclosures it's one disclosure, when you analyze it there may be 10 data points within that, and that's where I think it becomes challenging. So if we take something like employee information, there are very few who report against every single data requirement, because it may be they don't have the split by gender, or they don't have the split between permanent and temporary, by region. There's so many ways that we ask them to cut it that they do give us some information, but maybe they don't address every single aspect of it. There are others like scale of operations where we are referred to the financials, and it's not clear where to find that information necessarily. So, you're searching through a very lengthy annual report, and you're like, well, where is this disclosure? Supply chain, so I'm just talking about one that core reporters that everybody has to comply with. Supply chain, again, that is one requirement within the disclosure, but sometimes there's reference to supply chain, but they don't really go on to explain any further. So for me, there is certainly inconsistent application, if I can use that term. But there is a question of how well have we articulated what it is that we're asking for. So some of our disclosures we start with whether the reporting organization has. And if there is an absence of a statement? Is that because they had nothing to report, or have they just completely ignored that disclosure? So I think there's certainly some appetite for, without changing the substance per se of the existing general disclosures, some refinement and clarification in what it is we're seeking to achieve by those individual reporting disclosures. And that was the intent of this. So not a whole scale look at, do we have the right governance, but with the existing ones, can we improve the quality of the wording? So I'll invite any comments, input into this final work stream.
Discussion about general disclosures. Corley.
Sarah Jane, do you have a sense for where there are existing kind of concerns or issues? Or are you kind of foreseeing a more holistic review of most of them?
I think the intent is we would look to see if there was clarification of wording, but there certainly are troublesome ones: supply chain, scale of operations, just something that you would think is quite simple, capitalization. I think there's confusion as to what we are actually asking for. And I think for me, going back, like Robin said, with the in accordance into the archives to see what it was we hope to provide a reader or user of the report by asking for that piece of information for every reporting organization would be a worthwhile project in itself, so that we can all be sure that the types of information we're asking for is achieving a purpose.
Gustavo.
Hi. Thanks. As I see, as Evan says, the structure is good. I think that the first part of the disclosures about what the company is, I believe that it's even applied to an SME company, to all kind of companies. So I think it's correct. There are some disclosures that could be reorganized, but I think that it's like a good presentation of the company way, that part of the disclosures. Of course, the stakeholder disclosures are good. I think that it's okay, that part. Some of them should be reorganized, but I think that it's clear. The first part is clear and could apply to all kind of companies. That's all.
Other discussion on general disclosures? I mean, I would personally just be very interested to know what's the actual uptake across the general disclosures, which ones are reported and which ones are not reported, and maybe we can understand a little bit about why if we understand the what.
Yeah, definitely. And some of them seem to cause confusion as to what we're asking for, like the precautionary principle. So just a very high-level report. For 17 of the 45 reports we looked at, it's not clear how they've addressed it.
Yeah, and I think we have to be mindful here when we say it's confusion, what it is reported is also we're asking some things that are difficult to report for organizations. I think the precautionary principle for me stands out, having had very many discussions with US-based companies. There is no opportunity, even if reporting function drives reporting on this internally, there is no opportunity to report on this in certain legal context in which multinationals are operating. So I think there's also this but there are certainly things where it's unclear what the information request is, and structured interviews to go after a couple of the reporters that have not reported and to try to find out what the reasons behind it is. I think that's certainly something we can do. There is potential for consolidation as well, and I think that's something probably where we could even achieve more, because What we haven't done in the general disclosures really is to look at duplication of information requests. For example, we ask in different ways around employee numbers, these kind of things. And there is, I think these are straightforward changes. They don't actually impact companies in terms of how they consolidate information, because they've probably adjusted their practice to the reality and said, well, we only fulfill one of the information requests, but it would make for a much more succinct presentation of the general disclosures as such. So I think that's definitely something we can look at.
Okay. I'm not really, I think we've probably gotten to the end of that one. Yeah? Yep. What do you?
Yep. I think.
Okay.
Okay. This was the, on the premise that we do go ahead with some or all of our suggestions in terms of areas to gather further information with which to inform us as to where revisions may be appropriate. This was our initial timeline. So this is proposed, certainly not set in stone at this point. So we would go ahead and spend the summer months until September GSSB gathering the data, working with the subcommittee, GSSB subcommittee, to come up with some recommendations, and we would hope to table those at the September in-person meeting. We would hope that in the June meeting we would have some updates, not all areas necessarily, but certainly some things to table to have a meaningful discussion about. And we would look to go for public comment in Q3, such that by early 2020 we would be able to start analysing public reaction to the recommendations.
Any questions about this? I mean, obviously the timeline here is presented with reference to the human rights disclosures as well. Is there anything that needs to be sort of clarified about that? I mean, I think given the discussion that we had yesterday, possibly not, but just to acknowledge that that's the case. Okay.
Yeah, I potentially think one of the things that we would look to prioritise and accelerate is this scenario modelling of where the human rights could be incorporated and what impacts that would have, so that we can then understand the other areas of the project scope. Okay, and then I referred earlier to evidence gathering activities, and I know certainly when we tabled the draft proposal back in February, there was a certain input of, we need to ensure that we strike a good balance of getting views from reporters, report preparers, but also report users as well, to be informed about their understanding of reporting and various reactions. So we had gathered together on this slide a summary of the different data points that we would pursue. So as I've talked about some very high-level analysis so far, we have done some research of reviewing standards reports to try and inform us, not so that we can statistically say, this is wrong, that is right, but as to a directional indication of where we would focus our time, what appears to be the more troublesome areas, such that when we come to have follow-up interviews with reporters and we hold workshops and forums with other stakeholders too, that we can really address the areas that we think are challenging and that we have a more focused discussion with them. So there is that aspect. Another area we've talked about gathering views from a range of stakeholders, and we intend to do this by releasing a survey. So we have been already crafting suggested content for this survey, and I think the questions that we ask differ slightly depending on whether we're asking a reporting organisation, a consultant, and then report users. There's also a question mark over whether we pursue assurance providers, because of anyone, they are expected to have a good operational understanding of how the standards are applied, particularly if they're providing third-party assurance against it. So this was a range of activities that we were proposing to gather this information to inform us as to where revisions could potentially be made.
Okay, any questions? No? Yep, Vincent.
Well, I just have a quick questions about the consultancy and assurance provider. Right now, I know this piece is not regulated, highly regulated. So probably you will encounter the same group of people. So I just wondering any target organization or target parties that you aim to engage?
Do you have thoughts about the audiences for these activities?
In terms of workshops and forums that we would seek to obtain consultants and assurance providers, I think, we can start with the major accounting consulting firms that we know operate in this area. So I think for me that's quite clear who we would go and seek input from, and some of them we have good partnerships with anyway, we're liaising with regularly. In terms of the survey, obviously that would be open for anyone, and we promote that widely. We'd obviously ask who they are and in what capacity they're providing the responses, and then we would provide them with tailored questions based upon their, capacity.
Anyone else? Corley?
Just a question, the type of survey questions you would look at in things like the reporting principles, stakeholder inclusive materiality, and so on. I would suggest that it's important there to get a sense for the extent to which there is confusion between interpretation or in interpretation between different kinds of frameworks, and whether that has an implication on how they interpret or apply the principles in GRI reports. Because I have a sense, that in South Africa, for example, I think concepts like integrated reporting has a significant influence on the way that companies then interpret these kinds of principles. So I think it would be interesting for me, certainly, to understand the feedback from that kind of perspective and the balance between different suites of reports and the approach. That makes sense.
Gustavo.
Yeah, thanks. I think for the reporting principles, I know the GRI has the roundtables meetings. I don't know if they are included and receiving input from there.
Yeah, we will certainly seek to piggyback around the regions on existing platforms where we're engaging with various stakeholders. In some areas there may not be something, so we would, seek to put something in place, but a combination of in-person, where that makes sense, webinars, etc. And then in terms of reporters, I think individual interviews to really understand what's driving them to use comprehensive, or what's preventing them from using comprehensive, and their understanding. And what will be interesting is, I know the Corporate Reporting Dialogue Better Alignment Project was mentioned yesterday. They have a survey that was released last week. And although it is anchored to the TCFD recommendations, they are asking questions such as, which frameworks are you familiar with? This is very much focused on investors, so we have to take it in that light. But are the differences between the frameworks generating confusion if you choose to report, in compliance with more than one? So we will certainly get hold of that feedback and use that to inform us. We don't take that as, a direct reaction, but to your point about the different frameworks, that will certainly be a good data point for us.
Bastian, I was trying to find it, but you had mentioned a number yesterday of people that had given us express permission to email contact with. It'd be nice if the survey could be proactively sent to that list.
Yeah, this is exactly also the target audience of at least some of the mailings, and we have, I think, 28,000 right now that have given permission to be contacted for this type of engagement with us. So that and what we've seen in the past when we send out to that specific group requests to engage with our processes, we have a relatively high response rate actually. So. The team's not sure whether that's good or bad, as the survey is like, but I think we actually have a way to engage people directly, also in survey type of.
Okay, thanks for that input. I think we can skip through this. So some next steps. We have Peter and Robin, who are sitting in our subcommittee, and we will start in earnest if we decide to go ahead with this project very soon. But we did initially seek for 3 members, because I think that gives us a good balance. So we are still seeking a 3rd subcommittee member, if anyone would like to nominate themselves. So just put that out there.
Does it need to be today?
Nope. So Peter and Robin.
Sarah Jane, can you, for me who's a new member, can you just give us a sense of what that entails?
So I think monthly we would look to have a meeting, a virtual call with the subcommittee, and we would just welcome your input in terms of overall direction. So it's not that we're seeking to delegate decision-making or anything like that to the subcommittee. We are looking for a sounding board per se, but it doesn't make sense to bring everything to the entire GSSB all the time. So it would just be giving us direction. We would provide you with papers for your input.
I think that the subcommittee could benefit substantially from having a reporting practitioner within it too. I'm pretty full up self, so I'm looking, Michelle volunteered. Great, thanks.
There might even be space for a 4th.
Yep.
Yeah, and Jennifer almost looked like she was going to volunteer too. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so fairly full up at the moment, but we can talk about it. Yeah. I'm interested, for sure, in the topic, so.
I can confirm that I'm interested too, and I already do it for a council of the conference board and also in the sustainability advisory board of the conference board itself. So it's just to say that this is the kind of dialogue I'm used to.
So I look forward to at least one new member very soon. So back to the survey, as I've said, we are in the process of developing content. We have a draft, and the project group, which involves a number of members of the standards division, providing input into that. Because although I am overall the project manager as such, the work streams are separated between myself and Laura, just in terms of resource availability. And the survey we would aim to release for the month of May. And we would welcome if you would like your input. So our proposal was that we would share the content with you for the week starting the 15th of April. And if you wanted to provide input, you can. And that's the window that we would aim for. So there's a few nods around the room, so I take that as something you would be interested in doing.
Yeah. I would take that as well, Sarah Jane. One question that occurs to me, because you mentioned a few minutes ago the Better Alignment Project of the Corporate Reporting Dialogue doing some of their own kind of stuff. You don't need to answer this now, but do we know what their timeline and their schedule, and maybe if there are any others out there, just the issue of survey fatigue that we're all kind of familiar with, and also wanting to just sort of capture whatever we can out of work that somebody else is doing, so that we don't have to create everything ourselves all the time. But anyway, I just put that there.
No, so I think in principle we have access to all the results of that particular survey, so that can certainly inform the GSSB. In terms of overlap, having been part of the early COD discussion, I don't think there will be much overlap, because it's a very specific ask that they have. And this is somewhat unrelated. And I think the networks that we reach out to are very different.
Yeah, and I think the survey, we seek to answer questions that can be easily responded to, and I think our approach so far is not to mandate every single question, because if people, get halfway through and they never submit it, we lose the half that they did answer. So there's certain ways that we're thinking of that we can encourage at least some response, if it's not responses to all the questions that we would like. And then another ask is if you have specific stakeholders that you think it is worthy of us having focus groups, interviews with, academic experts, please do contact me directly with that input. I would very much welcome it. And any other input as you go away and reflect on the discussions that we have had. And as I said, at the next GSSB meeting, which will be a call in June, we would propose to provide you with updates on timelines, status, what we have identified so far in terms of the findings.
Right, any other questions or points on this? Okay. So are we now at the stage where we are looking at the approval of item 8, which is the project proposal for the review of the universal standards, which we have just been talking through for the last hour and a bit. Members feel like we know enough about what the content and approach is, what the desired results are. Is there anything that is sort of outstanding in your minds with respect to how we go about approving this project that we need to discuss still? I'm not seeing any. Okay, are there any concerns or objections to approving this project proposal? I see none, I hear none. Therefore, we have approved the item 8, the project proposal for the review of the universal standards. Thank you very much. And we look forward to getting this underway. Okay, well, I think we're a little ahead of schedule, not a lot ahead of schedule. But what this means is that we'll take a break now. We will reconvene the public session after lunch. The remainder of our morning, as you know from your agenda, is executive session and some administrative discussion. Corley, yes.
Judy, we need to still discuss the stakeholder council response under this item.
We do, don't we? We do.
Maybe if you can just paraphrase quickly for the universal standards.
The content of item 2 for the universal standards. This is the stakeholder council responses.
So the feedback that we gathered from Carol, stakeholder council chair, I felt was more captured by the discussion that we had yesterday, because it was very aligned with the human rights disclosures, and wasn't so much with the rest of the scope. So
if I can just clarify specifically what's in, so item 2 covers, there are a couple of overall comments. There's the oil and gas sector, agriculture sector, textiles and apparel sector and the universal standards. And the one comment on universal standards from the Stakeholder Council is, whilst there is agreement that human rights disclosures are key, there is not agreement to removing the human rights-related GRI-specific standards and making human rights disclosures mandatory for all organizations. There is concern that this approach might be unclear and result in a decreased focus on human rights issues. We did have a fairly extensive discussion of that yesterday. So while it came through in the context of the universal standards, the Stakeholder Council, as far as I understand it, has not provided other commentary that's relevant to the wider project that we have been discussing this morning. Is that clear? Okay. All right. Good.
In terms of time that we reconvene after lunch, given that we are a bit ahead of schedule, it is probably possible to reconvene already at 1 o'clock for the public meeting.
I would agree, 1 o'clock.
And then probably close the meeting a bit earlier.
Yeah. Okay. So 1 o'clock Amsterdam time for the reconvening the public meeting. Thank you very much, and we will carry on at that point.